everyone,
Great.
to another lecture in the Center for the Study of the Public Domain's Information Ecology lecture series. Thank you very much for coming out, staying out on this very snowy day. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Jenkins, who is the architect and organizer of this series, which has actually been extraordinarily successful in bringing people together around the university, and Jennifer has done a wonderful job in setting it up. We're very lucky today to have with us James J. Hamilton, J to his friends, who's the Oscar Tang Professor of Public Policy Economics and Political Science at the Public Policy School here. Some of us just have, Professor of Law, don't get to cover, 2 or even 3 disciplines. As Jay knows, our introductions here don't go through the person's entire curriculum vitae, but rather try and talk a little bit more synthetically about their work. And I'm particularly glad to have Jay here for a number of reasons to speak to us. The name of we wanted a name in the lecture series which reflected the diversity of issues that scholars around Duke and students around Duke are working on, and information ecology was as loose and fuzzy as we could come up with. But it did get the sense of a system which is interrelated, which is complex, where small changes have massive consequences, where there are subsystems which are poorly understood, and where a multitude of disciplines are needed to understand what's going on. And that, I think, is something which Jay's work illustrates precisely. Jay brings, both in his the work that he's going to talk about today, All the News That's Fit to Print, and in his prior work on channeling violence and indeed on risk assessment, brings a number of toolkits to the scholarly world, but particularly the toolkit of an economist. And speaking as a non-economist, but someone who's reliant on economists' work product, it's often occurred to me that economists are kind of like those who have been in Greek myths, blessed by the gods, but the blessing comes with a significant curse. And in the case of economists, the blessing is a particular kind of acuity of vision, which is often accompanied by a particular set of blindnesses. At least in the case of those of us who work in the intellectual property and communications area, both the acuity of vision and the blindnesses are frequently to be observed. I've been attracted to Jay's work before I ever knew him because he really was an exception to that broad generalization. In particular, one of the things that I find most fascinating about his work is that he manages to take the rigor and precision that economics at its best can bring to a subject, focus on markets, broadly conceived, and yet not to adopt the kind of narrow reductionist focus which sadly some of its better known practitioners often bring to it. And this is particularly important when you're writing about things where the subject is what is the output of a market, and you don't automatically assume that the output of the market is whatever the current distribution of income, wealth, and market structure yields, that's automatically optimum. The second thing that he brings, apart from that kind of broadness of vision, is an understanding which I, working from the legal theory side, particularly appreciate, which is the way in which law, in all of its roles, helps to structure information markets. Often people talk about regulation and markets as though law was something that only happened after markets were formed, but of course law is instrumental in forming markets in lots of ways, and I think Jay's work, and particularly some of the work that he's going to talk about today, will actually illustrate that. But no more ado, this is too much prologue, which perhaps is something that Jay can explain why news shows always have too much prologue. This is too much prologue. James Hamilton, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you today. The readings for today come from George Bush, and the first text is the following quote. There's a sense that people in America aren't getting the truth, and I'm mindful of the filter through which some news travels, and sometimes you have to go over the heads of the filter and speak directly to the people. And that's what George Bush told a regional television interviewer in October. In September of 2003, he was doing an interview with Brit Hume on Fox News, and Brit Hume asked him about his own news consumption, and this is what the president said. I glance at the headlines just to get a flavor for what's moving. I rarely read the stories and get briefed by people who probably read the news themselves. But I also understand there's opinions mixed in with news, and I appreciate people's opinions, but I'm more interested in news. And the best way to get news is from objective sources, and the most objective sources I have are the people on my staff who tell me what's happening in the world. So what I'm trying to do today is tell you how far you might get if you wanted to use economics to understand how that filter operates that President Bush is talking about, and how economics might help explain the mix of opinion and news that President Bush sees in information markets. The talk is going to be based on this book, hold it up for brand promotion, All the News That's Fit to Sell, How the Market Transforms Information into News. Now, this book has 70 charts in it and some mathematical modeling, and it's not really fit to convey in a talk like this. So what I decided to do was boil today's talk down to 6 questions. And so the 6 questions, I'm probably going to speak for only a half an hour because I'd like to get questions from you. The 6 questions I'm going to try to look at are, number 1, what economic concepts help explain news content? Number 2, why might the media be biased? Number 3, why is local television news so bad? Number 4, was it ever any different? Number 5, can the internet solve rational ignorance? And then question number 6 is the question which all Sanford professors end up with, which is what is to be done? So, although they don't credit Lenin for that. So what I'm going to do, that's right, adjunct. So what I'm going to talk about first are economic concepts. Most of the time when people think about the news, they think about the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why. What I try to argue in my book is that economics helps explain content because there are 5 economic questions that explain what comes out of a reporter or a producer. The 5 economic W's, I think, are who cares about a particular piece of information, what are they willing to pay for it, or what are others willing to pay for their attention, where can you reach these people through media outlets, when is it profitable to provide information, and why is it profitable to provide information? Those last 2 questions get at cost structure and the definition of property rights. Now, if you think about this, reporters don't get up and say, I need to maximize profits every day. What I'm arguing is that they operate as if these questions determine their survival in the marketplace. So they may not be asking these questions directly, but the types of reporters and the types of producers and the types of shows that survive in the marketplace are ones that are answering these 5 questions. When I think about the demand for news, the demand for information, I find most helpful the theories that Anthony Downs put forth. He said there are really 4 types of information demand that people have. One is producer information, information that you need to do your job. I used to be a management consultant. I was working for Ralston Purina. I read Hog Farm Management for my job. That helped me do my job better. When I was writing my dissertation, I read Waste Age because I was reading about hazardous waste. And now I read Broadcasting and Cable because I study media markets. That's all producer information. Consumer information, that's reading The Independent to know what movies are playing, reading to find out things that help you buy products. Entertainment information, that's just things that you want to know because you intrinsically find them interesting. So watching Friends on Thursday night, that's entertainment information. And finally, there's voter information, the things that could help you make a better decision as a citizen. Now, the first 3 types of information demands work fairly well because if you don't get the information, you don't get the benefit. If you don't go out and try to find where a movie is, you're not going to find the movie. It's not as if you go out in your car and start trying to follow random automobiles to get to a movie. You know, if you want to see the movie, you need to get the consumer information. The 4th type of information demand, voter information, works differently for the following reason. Suppose you really cared about a particular election. It made a big difference to you whether one candidate was going to win or whether another one was. And suppose more information would help you make that decision. Even if there was a lot on the line for you, what you need to do when you're trying to figure out if you want to invest in information is figure out, would your vote matter? Unless you're Justice Scalia, you're not the marginal voter. So you're not going to engage in the information gathering to find out things such as, is global warming real or not? Or what's really going to happen with Social Security? Anthony Downs called that rational ignorance and explains a great deal about how the news market operates. So if you were in a news market and you were trying to figure out what to talk about or what type of information to offer. You'd think a lot about information demand. You'd also think in a spatial market about product differentiation. What do I mean by that? If you were going to try to tell people the news, one of the things you might think about is, what are other people saying? What other messages are out there? You might think about, well, how costly is this for me to generate a story? That's the cost function. And you might think about, who do I care about reaching? Because advertisers place different values on different people. The empirical evidence seems to indicate that 18 to 34-year-olds are the most prized viewers in the advertising market for several reasons, one of which is their time is scarce. Advertisers will tell you, we can get people over 60 any time of the day because they're always watching television. 18 to 34-year-olds, their time is more scarce, the price is bid up, and there also is a belief, and it's a contestable belief, but a belief that perhaps their advertising, their product decisions are more open to influence because they haven't been making them all their life. And so when you're trying to decide who you want to attract to your media product, one of the things you're thinking about is, whose eyeballs can I sell to advertisers and how valuable are those? So we've got information demand, we've got product differentiation. One other thing that's different about news markets is that the news is an experience good. You have to look at it and even sample it a little bit to figure out what its content is. If I wanted to buy a blazer like this one, I could try it on and decide whether I liked it or not. But if you think about a news product, by definition it is supposed to be new, and so you might not know what's in the product. That presents a problem for the producer. So what they have to do is signal to you what it's going to be like. They have to establish some brand reputation. And one way to do it is to keep the person who's giving it to you the same as the story changes. And so that's one reason why journalists are becoming more a part of the product that they deliver. They become celebrities because that's a way to signal to you what the content is like. That means it's great to be an anchor because in a world of multiplying channels, their value goes up. And I show in the book that actually anchors are paid more now, and they're paid more per viewer. Even though they're getting fewer viewers, they're paid more per viewer for delivering them to the networks. It also means that we have people called political pundits, who you can think of as products themselves. And one of the things I do in the book is, and when I say I, you should think of a large number of work study students in the background processing information from Lexis. I looked at 500,000 words of political pundits and found that even for the same person, let's take George Will. There's print George Will and television George Will, and he adopts how he talks or writes depending on what the audience is. Print George Will is more abstract and talks about groups. Television George Will, in part because of the audience, talks about human interest, self-reference, and the language even changes for liberals and conservatives. If you look at liberal and conservative pundits and analyze their language, what you find is that liberals are more optimistic and talk with the group as the unit of observation. Conservatives are more pessimistic or ambivalent, have the individual as the unit of observation. And you find that on television, this difference is magnified relative to print. So those to me are all economic concepts that help explain the news. The news to me is not a mirror, it's a commodity. And when I think about what I see in news markets, rational ignorance, product differentiation, and the journalist as part of the product explains in part what's going on. So that was the first question. Second question, and again, I'm only going to speak for half an hour, so if you have questions in your mind already formulated, like how could he be so wrong, you'll get your chance. Second question, why might the media be biased? Today we think about objective reporting or nonpartisan reporting as almost a norm or a moral idea, but what I find in my book, in the second chapter of my book, is that nonpartisan reporting really came about as a commercial product. In fact, you can trace it back, if you look at newspapers, to the development of a high-speed press in the United States. The thing about high-speed presses is that they were very expensive. And if you look at media markets, newspaper markets in America in the 1870s, what you find is a partisan press. And then with the invention of these high-speed presses, all of a sudden, it became really great to travel down the cost curve, to spread your fixed costs across many different readers. And you needed to attract more readers to make this high-speed press work for you. And so what you started to do was to stop talking about politics in a partisan way in your reporting. you adopted a nonpartisan tone because it opened up at least three potential types of readers: Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So if you look at the shift in newspaper markets at large newspapers, for instance, 1870 to 1880, nonpartisan newspapers went from 25% to 75%. And you might say, well, how do you define this? I didn't define this. What I did was I was walking one day through a used bookstore in Chapel Hill, and I found a book from the 1890s that was actually sold to advertisers that described the self-applied political affiliation of every newspaper in the United States. The newspapers were trying to tell advertisers, this is the type of message that we have. And in the back, it's amazing. The newspapers took out advertising and said, these are the type of people who read us. And especially for the ethnic press, it was fascinating. There was a paper in Minnesota who said, we have Scandinavians, and we all know what they're like. They're hardworking. They want to buy your goods. So it was very fascinating the way that they used the audience of their newspaper to try to sell themselves. At the same time, advertising was becoming more important. Advertisers wanted to deal with one large paper rather than 5 small papers, in part because it's easier to do these negotiations. And so what you find is a pressure for nonpartisan reporting arising in part from a change in cost structure. Now, if you look today, you see changes in competitions that might lead you back to some bias in reporting. One of the things I found in my work was that there's an economic reason that there might be a slight liberal bias in the network evening news. And here's how the story goes. In the 1990s, the network evening news are losing viewers in part to cable. And if you look at who watches the network evening news, the majority of viewers are over 50. And people 18 to 34 are only 20% of the regular viewers of the network evening news, but they constitute 40% of the marginal viewers, the folks who sometimes tune in and sometimes don't. Now, if you're in the network evening news and you're thinking about how do I get that marginal viewer, you might think about changing the type of stories that you offer. And you might think, well, who would you rather have, a 35-year-old female as a viewer or a 50-year-old male? The advertising audience tells you it's the 35-year-old female for the reasons that we've talked about, and in part because survey data indicate that females are more likely to influence family purchasing decisions. So thinking about that type of reasoning, what I did is I looked at the beginning of the year, looked at survey data, divided up people by age and gender according to the categories that the Nielsen company uses, 18 to 34, 35 to 49, 50 plus, and looking at that by gender. If you look at the issues people are interested in, the networks are more likely over the course of the year to increase story time and increase story counts according to the interest of viewers who are 18 to 34, and in particular females 18 to 34. Well, how do the political interests of younger people or females differ from those of older males? Well, one of the things is that women are much more interested in issues of poverty, more interested in issues of families with children, and more interested in gun control. And if you actually look at the data, that's what you find, that the networks are responding to marginal viewers that they value differently. Now, I found that this works statistically. I wondered if it worked in the real world, so I looked at memoirs of people who were involved in television, and they actually did say things like, in the part of the news where we have some leeway, so if you think about the back stories, the American agenda, the things where they can prepare stories ahead of time, they say what we try to do is focus on stories that would interest women in their 30s and 40s. So the emphasis on youth, the emphasis on females, in part, when you combine that, gives you a potential liberal media bias on the network evening news. What about Fox News, you might say? Thanks for bringing it up. If you think about Fox News, what that is, it's the triumph of niche broadcasting. As the number of cable channels expands, your expected audience declines. If you were Roger Ailes, who runs Fox News, if you were Roger Ailes and somebody asked you, how would you attract 10 million people? He might not give you the content that you see on Fox News today. But if he's in a cable universe where you say, how do you attract 1 million people? Or how do you attract 2 million people? And by the way, if you get 2 million people, that's the #1 cable audience for news programming. What you would do is hire Bill O'Reilly, and you would have a program which appeals particularly to conservatives. Now, why do I say appeals particularly conservatives? What I did was I analyzed audience data. I looked at Pew data, which gives you, which asks people rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, liberalism and conservatism. And I also looked at people were watching, and I was able to figure out what programs have liberal audiences, what programs have conservative audiences. If you do that, the shows with the most conservative audiences are Focus on the Family and Fox News. Most liberal media outlets would be late night television talk shows and Harper's and the Atlantic Monthly. The media outlets which have a mean ideology, which is exactly the same as the mean ideology rating of the people in the survey, would be the Network Evening News and NPR. NPR actually has an average ideology the same as the national average. And then when you ask people, well, which programs are biased, there what you see is it just depends on what your worldview is. Liberals think that the programs that have the conservative audience are biased, and conservatives think that the programs that have liberal audience are biased. So it's basically product differentiation. Where your worldview is tells you in part whether something is biased or not. There's still nonpartisan reporting. In fact, if you're the only game in town, if you are a newspaper and you're the only major newspaper in your city, and that describes most cities in the United States, you still have this incentive to be nonpartisan. And the way I looked at that was I looked at, again, with a software called Diction, which takes each word in a story and compares it to 10,000 words, which is in a dictionary, and the words are divided up by different types of categories. What I found is that if you look at the newspapers that endorsed Bush versus the newspapers that endorsed Gore, and you looked at how they treated the same story, Gore's convention acceptance speech, you may remember a kiss involved there, and Bush's convention acceptance speech, there was no difference in the news stories for depending on whether the newspaper eventually endorsed Bush or Gore. They used the same language, same approach, and that to me was evidence that at least in that measure of bias, that the newspapers were not biased. Question number 3, why is local television news so bad? How many of you are regular viewers of local television news? Okay, that's what we would have predicted. Okay, but there are 56% of the U.S. who are regular viewers of local television news. And to the question, why is local television news so bad, they might respond to me, why are you so arrogant? Why would you say that local television news is bad? It happens to cover things that I am interested in. And that, to me, makes sense. If you look across local television news markets, the degree that you watch or the degree that you think it's working depends on how many people like you there are. If you have a strong interest in hard news, you better hope that that is shared by a large number of people in your market, because what I find statistically is that in local television markets where there's a strong interest in hard news, the local stations put on more hard news in the local news. Well, how do I define hard news and soft news here? How many of you watch the Lair News Hour occasionally? That's what I thought. Okay, so if you think about the Lair News Hour, you know at the end of the program, somebody will say, our top 3 stories tonight. Those are the stories that I defined in my analysis as hard news stories. How many of you will admit that you know what Inside Edition or Access Hollywood or Entertainment Tonight is? Okay. If you believe it or not, those are cataloged in Lexis too. And what I did was, for soft news stories, I counted the stories that are promoted on those shows. So I've got my hard news definition, my soft news definition. And then I looked via Lexis at the content, and I found that as interest in hard news in a market was greater. What did I use there? There I used the subscription rate for Time magazine in the market. Now, it's debatable about whether we think that is hard news, but of the things that they track, Modern Maturity, Playboy People, and Time, Time is really, in terms of the Nielsen data, Time was the best I could get there. And in terms of the interest in soft news, I used subscription rates to People magazine. So what do I find? That in markets where people are interested in hard news, you get more stories about senators, mayors, you get more stories about hard news topics. In markets with soft news, interest, you get more soft news in the local news. And in my previous work, Channeling Violence, what I found is that this also applies to crime stories. In fact, if you want to predict the percentage of crime stories in a local news broadcast, the actual FBI crime rate, again, those are debatable figures too, but they're sometimes the best that we have, that the crime rate does not predict the percentage of crime stories in the market. It's actually the ratings for Cops, the reality television show that predicts what type of crime you're going to see. And this even works on the individual story level. In my previous work, Channeling Violence, I actually have an analysis of which television stations carried allegations in 1993 against Michael Jackson of child molestation. And I did a statistical model, and it turns out the best predictor of whether a local news director thought Michael Jackson's story should be in the local news were the ratings for Melrose Place in that market, which those of you may not remember, it was sort of a melodramatic nighttime soap opera. And you might say, well, do people really think this way? Yes, they do. The local television station gets focus group data, survey data, and in fact, if you go back to last year, the #1 consultant to local television news stations provided their quarterly ranking of stories, potential stories, and the story that they said would have the least audience interest would be coverage of local protests against the war. They said, people tell us they're not interested in hearing about protests against the war. And so at the local level, they have survey data. On the network evening news, they have minute-by-minute Nielsen ratings by demographic group. So you can no longer, if you're on the network evening news and a correspondent, say, you know, there really is an audience out there for Bosnia, because they have minute-by-minute ratings, and they can figure out what sells and what drives people away. One other thing I found in the local news analysis was that they're a great way to promote the network stars. If you look within local television news in a given month I was looking at, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was a big program. 80% of ABC local news programs were talking about Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. 0% of the NBC affiliates were talking about it. If you look at Fox, they were all talking about a program called Greed, which was the competitor to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And this was also, the month that I happened to look at was when Barbara Walters was interviewing Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky stories in the ABC affiliates, not in the ABC affiliates, not in the NBC or Fox. So local news is a great way to promote product owned by the networks. Question number 4, was it ever any different? Well, if you travel back in time to 1969, let's think about that, it's a great year. What was different? Well, there were 3 major network televisions, the networks. The owners were still involved. The owners or original founders were still involved. They were willing to trade off some profits for the feeling that they were doing the right thing. And by the way, the FCC was looking over their shoulder. They had to tell them what type of public affairs reporting they're providing, how many hours. The companies were media companies. There were 7 channels on. They had an oligopoly of the image, which means that you didn't have big satellites, so people had not seen the major stories on the local television news before. They were capturing 1/3 of the audience, and there were only 7 channels per household. So if you didn't want to watch one of the 3 networks, which could agree to be boring at the same time. I mean, that was the thing about this oligopoly. You could do your public service, you could do well, and you were competing against Mr. Ed. And that was about it. Flash forward to now. What's going on now? Well, the average home has more than 70 channels now. 85% of the U.S. has cable or satellite. The media companies are owned by publicly traded stock companies that are not major media companies anymore. They're large conglomerates. The FCC is no longer really looking over your shoulder. In the 1980s, the chairman of the FCC said, the public interest is defined by the public's interest, and we are no longer going to ask you about your public affairs programming. And so what you see is a pressure for entertainment, a pressure for soft news. The way I tried to look at this is, let's find a set of standard stories that you would get across time. So I used congressional quarterlies, annual rating of what the major votes were in the Senate. I used the Harvard Law Review's annual article about what the major Supreme Court cases were that year. I used Americans for Democratic Action and American Conservative Unions count of what the major votes were, and I used People's 25 Most Intriguing People of the Year as my proxy for soft news stories. And I look across time at how all of these things are covered in the network evening news. The good news for the lawyers in the crowd is that coverage of the Supreme Court has stayed about the same. About half of the major cases defined by Harvard Law Review get covered on the network evening news. If you look at the Congressional Quarterly major legislative votes, that's gone from about 80% get covered to about 60% get covered. Unless you like your news light, if you're watching NBC, that's about 45%, because NBC has decided to go more soft news, less hard news. If you look at the major interest group votes, they've gone from about 60% of those votes get covered to about 40% get covered. And if you look statistically at what was when these changes took place, as cable competition went up, as the percentage of households of cable went up, hard news coverage went down. And as deregulation came in, you saw more soft news, people from people, popping up on the network evening news. Does that make the network evening news a soft news outlet? No, not by any means. It's still majority hard news, but it does show you that economic considerations change over time, generate a change in the content. Fifth question, fifth of six, can the internet solve rational ignorance? Well, one of the nice things about the internet is that you don't have these large fixed costs of delivery, but you do still have content creation costs. So it's not as if we're all going to get our daily meat, that there's going to be a set of, that there's going to be an ideal internet site which will give you all the information that you want for free. You still need to get information, you still need to sell eyeballs to advertisers. So what that means is that the internet is not going to give you your ideal set of information. It still has to rely on aggregating eyeballs to advertisers. How did I look at how the internet market operates? I did a couple of things. Number one is I looked at the 100 top newspapers in the U.S., and if you look at the top 5 newspapers in the U.S., New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they account for about 20% of all the circulation. But they account, the top 5 newspapers on the web account for about 40% of all the links. So the good news is that the existence of the internet lets you get higher quality news if you choose to do it. I again ran my test of hard news and soft news. I looked at the internet and I did the following things. I defined hard news and soft news in the way that I've talked about before, and I looked at what people were searching for in search engines. I looked at what people were talking about on websites, and I actually got data on what advertisers were paying to be associated with particular search terms. And so there what I found was that on the internet, hard news topics are talked about more than soft news topics if you just count up websites. And that makes sense because not everything on the internet is driven by profit. You have nonprofits, you have governments, you have a lot of people giving you information for free. The question is, are you searching for it? If you look at soft news terms versus hard news terms, soft news terms are twice as likely to be searched than hard news terms. So, and again, that goes back to rational ignorance and Downs' prediction about entertainment. And if you're talking about consumer or producer information, things that help you buy a particular product, that is searched 20 times more than hard news topics. And if you look at advertisers, they're much more willing to pay to be associated with soft news versus hard news for the following reason. If you're interested in soft news, you might be willing to buy the soft news CD produced by the star. You might be looking to go to a particular movie. So for all those reasons, hard news is out there on the internet, but you may not be trying to find it. So what is to be done? What policy recommendations could you make? I think economics does a great job in explaining the content of the media. I think it's much more difficult to make a claim that you should then follow policy X for a couple of reasons. Number one is the FCC is supposed to regulate broadcast in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Where did that come from? It turns out it might have come from a railroad regulation statute, and when they were drafting communications, they brought that term in. Well, how would you define the public interest? If you ask an economist that, he'll laugh or she'll laugh and say, Ken Arrow got the Nobel Prize for proving that the public interest doesn't exist, that there's no function that would take how everybody in this room feels and give us some decision if you want that function to satisfy some fairness properties. Well, economists often can tell you how to make your life better. What do? They're often using cost-benefit analysis as their as their tool. But the interesting thing about politics, and Jamie alluded to this first, all economists should start their discussions with the disclaimer, for a given distribution of income, I can tell you how to reach an efficient nirvana. But if we're going to have a debate about politics, ruling out some discussions about, well, is this a good distribution of income to start with? That makes it a little hard. And as Cass Sunstein has pointed out, economists also like to take preferences as a given. But if we're talking about the impact of the media and their ability to influence your preferences, that makes the toolkit a little bit problematic. But assume that we even threw that out and said, can economics or political science tell you the impact of information on the policy outcome? That's even harder, because what I would need would be able to say, okay, here's some content, let's change the content, who consumed it, did it change their opinion, did it change their political actions, and did they happen to be in the areas where the marginal voters were, and did that change the political outcome? Because we know so little about all of those things, I think it's very hard to make explicit recommendations. But suppose I could take off the social science hat and somebody just said, I want more hard news. How do I get it? Okay? So assuming you told me that you wanted more hard news, then the economists can come back in and say, well, here's the toolbox. Here are things that can help you get more hard news. Number one, reduce the cost of hard news generation, maybe by having a better Freedom of Information Act. You would get more hard news stories. Maybe we could really figure out what was going on with the Vice President's Energy Task Force if there was a real Freedom of Information Act, if you lower the cost of information provision to reporters. Number two, there are only 4 here, so number 2 would be more activity by nonprofits. What do I mean by that? Nonprofits can give you information that then get repeated by news media who themselves have fewer and fewer resources to generate their own information. So if you look at the Pew surveys, for instance, Andrew Cohat, those of you who watch Lair NewsHour, if the nonprofit is generating the information, it's more likely to get incorporated in news stories. Or if you think about journalism training, that's another role that nonprofits can do. Rational ignorance means that newspapers can't afford to train reporters well to cover stories. I can say that because I did a survey of 800 journalists who cover business and economics. It was anonymous, although I know Andy Rooney was in the sample because he wrote me back a note on the survey that said, if I were ever going to go on the QE2, I might have time to fill this survey out. So he's not in the survey. But of the people who were in the survey, they said that when I gave them sample stories to cover about economics, people who covered economics from a human interest, from a personal side, or from a horse race political side actually get paid more than people who cover economics from an economics perspective, because economics, you might feel this after 30 minutes, can be slightly boring. And so that means that the reporters don't get paid to learn the economics, and so that means the nonprofits might be the people to do it. And the other thing is nonprofit ownership. Why couldn't we have more nonprofit ownership? Mother Jones, Ms. Magazine, Harper's, all run by foundations. St. Petersburg Times, a few other newspapers, Christian Science Monitor, NPR, those are all nonprofit. So rather than try to regulate for-profit entities in a way that would make them do something, I think that calling on nonprofits might be a better way. Number 3, norms. You might stress among reporters the fact that their product has positive externalities. Once they had the training, what they would see was that would mean that they have positive spillovers on society, that they actually help people be better voters, and they realize that today. One thing to note, though, is that you have to really rely on a market failure for that to work. And what I mean by that is, if you want them to do things that help society, it may not be profit maximizing. And so you might get this appeal to norms to work in newspapers because it's harder to monitor what's profit maximizing. but it's not really a good idea to expect to go to a network correspondent and say, you should do what's right. You should really try to cover Haiti or Bosnia and sneak it by your bosses because they've got the minute-by-minute demographic Nielsen's, and that's not going to work. Unless you want to try to change norms to the extent that people come to see investing in media companies almost like a green initiative, that they're doing something in terms of social investing. And the fourth thing would be when you're defining property rights, take into account the positive spillovers that news has on people's lives. So what would that mean? Well, that would mean when you're making decisions about what information, for example, should be in the public domain, you might tip the scale a little bit more when you remember that, sure, the market operates well for many types of news, but there's a type of information that's going to be underprovided, so maybe we would think about that when we were making information more widely available. Or there's something called the Digital Trust Fund now, which is the proposal in Congress to take information from spectrum auctions and have an NSF of the information world that would try to subsidize the creation of information that would eventually make its way into news. And finally, and this is probably the thing that generated my first hate email, I was recently on The State of Things and talked for a little while, and I got my first hate email where somebody said, this idea was utterly bizarre. I can't believe that you said it. Wouldn't it be great if we could change the campaign finance laws that would allow more money into politics and allow political parties to reinstitute partisan press by buying cable channels? Right now, there's $1 billion in political advertising out there trying to convey political information. Right now, there's soft money that the parties could use or could have used before campaign finance to actually buy a cable channel. And if you go back to the 1990s, briefly for 1 week, there was something called GOP TV on the Family Channel where they rented the Family Channel and covered the convention in a partisan way. So I'm searching for ideas, and I think that those are 4 types of them. Hopefully I've said something that's upsetting, and I'd like to hear your questions. Professor Lang.
Jay, let me ask you this question. Does your model account for the reason why there's a Rush Limbaugh and a lot of little Rush Limbaugh-ettes on the right and nobody who corresponds to them on the left?
Okay, so the question would be why does Rush Limbaugh exist in the format that he does? And
Not quite the question.
right, but that's the question I can answer. So it's interesting. Let's think about Rush Limbaugh first. There's a great article in the Journal of Legal Studies that looks at the fairness doctrine, and the fairness doctrine actually had a chilling effect on radio. And I know you know this, but the other folks might not. So one of the reasons why we can have Rush Limbaugh now is because we don't have the fairness doctrine. Stations were afraid of being controversial, and once the fairness doctrine was removed, Rush could go on. So your question is, why didn't Jim Hightower or Mario Cuomo succeed? Whereas, because those were well-known liberals, and their radio programs did not succeed. I think in part, and again, I have to say I think now because it's not a part of my statistical analysis, it may in part involve who's driving around in a car during a certain period of time and who can be sold to advertisers. And it might be men, and it might be men that are valuable to advertisers. And so Rush Limbaugh can exist. I don't think that it means that there might not be a room for liberal people. If you want to hear liberal people today, you can buy satellite radio, because if you have 100 channels, there's actually a liberal tinged channel on satellite radio now. And Al Gore is trying, and other people are trying, to put together a liberal network, but it's going to be a market test. Other people will say there's something about those ideas of liberals versus conservatives. That might be true. Remember I said that when I looked at the language of pundits, that the liberals were positive and group-oriented, and the conservatives were negative and individual-oriented, and maybe it's more interesting to call somebody a feminazi than sing Kumbaya. So, I mean, that's it. Yeah.
I like the idea of having more nonprofit media organizations. In the St. Petersburg Times is every newspaperman's ideal, except none of us can figure out what it does differently. Eugene Patterson was visiting here several years ago, and I asked him, name one thing you've done differently because you're a nonprofit. And he said, well, we bought color presses a little sooner than we would have otherwise.
Right.
And so my theory is that there's so much herding behavior among journalists that even when they have the opportunity to behave differently from profit-driven companies, they don't, because they just don't have any incentive to take a chance and be different. Do you think it's necessary to get some critical mass of nonprofit media before the effect will kick in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There is a notion, they use this phrase in educational TV, you have to reach before you teach. So you have to have a certain audience before you feel like you're even doing anything. But I think that if you look at nonprofit content, Harper's, Mother's, Jones, Ms., I mean, that is definitely different media content. I remember reading the most extensive coverage of President Bush's National Guard service 2 years ago in a great timeline in Mother Jones. And then 2 years later it appears here. And so I think that nonprofit, and if you look at the content of NPR, it's different too. Newspapers, yeah, I agree. I don't think we know enough yet about how it's different. The nice thing is, I know that your class is studying this at UNC, where you're contrasting St. Petersburg Times with the Tampa Tribune and others. So, it will be an empirical test. Yeah.
And you think that help us think it's a really subtle difference in that much more. We have a lot of using fiction to see if they have different tone.
Different language. Yeah, well, not to give away my own research ideas for next year, but one of the things that I think is interesting is when I wrote this book, I didn't want it to be another on the long line of the media are bad, you know, or things aren't working. So that's why I try to offer hopeful solutions. But I think it would be interesting to see the different types of questions that people focus on if they're not as profit-driven. So different parts of government, for instance. So looking across cities, if you look at the indicators of what's going on, and then seeing if people are willing to talk about it, even if it's not interesting, I think would be a nice test. Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. 2 questions. In the book, you mentioned some comparative data, and I'm actually interested in pushing you in that direction, because presumably a lot of the trends that you're talking about apply across countries, at least if it's a large enough country, and there's some degree of political spread that's roughly similar. And yet, the nature, for example, of newspaper media in large Western European countries and in the US is very different. You mentioned this in the book, but I'd be interested in having you explain a little bit why the same forces of wanting to reach more people to pay for the large fixed costs don't produce that, and in fact, on the contrary, produce inflected, highly editorialized news. It was very interesting during the Iraq War how many people were actually switching to read, the Independent, the Guardian, whatever, because there was the intensity of feeling was so great. People actually, in some sense, wanted to have the guy who's in Iraq, who's condemning it, who's on the front page of the Independent, as opposed to the sort of gray story from the New York Times. I'd be interested, what's the difference? Second thing that I guess leads off the first, I loved your set of disclaimers at the end and how important they are in sort of imposing sort of modesty on where the economics can help you and where it can't. And you come up with, if you wanted more hard news, which is an easy one to sell, because we all know saying, come on, there should be more information. It's hard to argue against that, although there is some data, obviously, that more information can, in certain situations, reduce decision-making efficiency rather than not. But, I mean, I guess I want to push you a little bit on that, because obviously the fact that you picked that rather than some other, also fairly controversial thing, indicates a particular set of leanings of yours. And the people you quote, including Cass Sunstein and others, have a sort of more detailed political theory, which indicates that you get politics where you have people who are engaged with the society, who are virtuous citizens in Republican sense of the term. Some of those, the people you quote, sometimes approvingly have those views. It's not clear that more information makes for the virtuous citizen. It might be that more highly inflected, highly partisan exchanges make it's more the person who starts to feel about politics the way the Duke basketball fan feels about the Duke basketball team, who may be more involved in politics. Do you have any hidden, non-economic, non-statistical, personal Jay Hamilton views about whether or not that's so, and if so, what the possible desirable limits of policy would be to encourage those kinds of preference-forming issues? Because as you noted, it's really hard to assume preferences are fixed here, since the very thing you're studying is the input which actually helps form people's preferences.
On the second question, I have no desire to end up in a Duke Conservative Union newspaper ad. Okay, so there's Jay Hamilton, private person, and Jay Hamilton professor. But the serious answer to the second question is, I don't assume that more information makes you virtuous, and I don't think the empirical evidence tells you right now that if we fed somebody the New York Times, that they might be more likely to be a better citizen. And in fact, there is a very interesting paper which is now called, you can find on the internet, does the New York Times spread apathy and ignorance? Because there's statistical research that shows that as the New York Times circulation goes up in local markets, that voting by college-educated folks goes down. And the notion is that they're now reading the Times, and they're not reading the Raleigh News and Observer, so they're not engaged to go into local politics. There's also the other thing that I know you know about, low information rationality. We just need a couple of things to know about somebody. And in my class yesterday in politics, I put up 3 candidates and asked that I said would be potential vice presidential candidates for the Democrats, assuming Kerry was the nominee, John Edwards, Wes Clark, and Joel Marcus. And I asked people to rate them on a thermometer scale, 0 to 100. And out of the class, 40% rated Joel Marcus as 0 to 40. Joel Marcus is the best man at my wedding. He's not in politics. But all I had to say was Democrat, potential vice presidential, and Joel Marcus, you can probably figure out he's a male. And that's enough for 40% of the folks in the class to rate him on something. So in terms of the, actually, this is the 18th time I've taught this class, and he knows that I use him as my straight man, yeah, and my best man. So the amount of information that people have, that's one of those black boxes, and that's why I'm not willing to, it would be great if I could just feel that I knew the type of information that would get more political activity. Your first question, if you think about New York City, there are enough people there for many newspapers to get down the average cost curve, to have large circulations. And when you have that true, what you often find is product differentiation, highbrow, lowbrow, thinking tabloid, or left-right. And you see that in American cities. I think of England, no offense, as a big city. Well, it's close enough. I think of that as like a big city, and actually their papers are really regional, and so it's almost like the things that, because of transportation costs and things like that, that you get people who read the Independent or the Guardian across different cities, and so it's almost like you have this mass of people. And if you have a huge mass of people, then you see this product differentiation, whether you're in the U.S. or whether you're over there. If you look at other countries, one of the reasons you see highly partisan presses is because there are still some subsidies that go on, which is what we used to have to see. Yes, Jonathan.
I wanted to ask you about the time value of news, how ephemeral it is. And you talked about the Mother Jones story having been 2 years, about the National Guard source having been 2 years before. I was thinking also that on radio, this is maybe soft information or entertainment information, that it's typical that local or student stations play songs several months to a year before they're on more mass media stations. And more generally, my question is, how has the time value of news or this kind of information changed over time and with the structure of the industry? So that a century ago, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided INSGAP, trying to keep news organizations from poaching on each other because the time value of news, and that was a 3-hour time difference. We didn't have 24-hour news cycles, but a 3-hour time difference was crucial to the property value, the marketability of the news. So now, everybody gets everything almost simultaneously, and there's the crawl on the bottom of every news station, or almost every station. It seems like the timing has been compressed enormously. How is that affected by market structure, and how does that affect?
Sure. The timing, you can think of it in a couple ways. Satellite images available cheaply across different places, and the internet making information available very quickly. Does a couple of things. One is it makes accuracy go down. If I have a pressure because everybody else is talking about a particular story and I'd like to look at it in a little bit more depth before I run with it, it might make me less accurate in the information that I purvey. Not for everybody, because some people have a market brand for credibility or high quality news. I could say the New York Times, it's taken a hit over the last year, but still, if you look at the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they might be less willing to go with the rumor, but many other people would feel a pressure, especially in electronics. So I think that the availability of information creates a pressure for telling a story, which may make it less accurate. And at the same time, the breaking news becomes a commodity. One thing that I didn't mention was that on the internet, prices are generally driven down to marginal cost. The marginal cost is zero, so price gets driven down to zero. So everybody's throwing information out for free. Breaking news is a commodity, and then you have to figure out, well, how do I differentiate myself, given all this breaking news that's out there? And maybe it's by providing some context. So when breaking information is a commodity and available widely, some people will say, maybe I need to provide a context. So the Seattle newspaper, for instance, has a rule that its local columnists can only write about local issues. They can't mention international issues because their niche is we're local. Sure, you can get other news on the New York Times on the internet and things like that, but we're going to be local. So the pressure of immediate breaking news being freely available means that you might be less accurate, and it might also mean that you would try to differentiate yourselves. For the network evening news, the availability of satellite images on local television has meant that sometimes what they try to do now is provide a context. So if you go back to the research I was talking about, they're less likely to tell you about a congressional bill, but I find that if they do talk about a congressional bill, they do talk about it in more length than they used to in the 1980s.
Consultants, like you mentioned, like Frank McGinn, if I don't really know much about that, I thought that might be something interesting to explain.
Yeah, they're the number one folks. You can subscribe if you're a local television a news station, and they tell you what works in terms of what stories people are interested in. And just like Jonathan was talking about radio stations do the same type of research. Local television news stations do the same type of research. They're trying to find out what you're interested in. They don't really have an incentive to think about the public affairs impact of what they're doing. They're just trying to get the eyeballs. And I'll use an example, WNCN. When I wrote my book about TV violence, WNCN stood for We Never Cover News, or No Content News. And the reason that I'm willing to say that is that when the reporter came to interview me about television violence, first thing they said was, do you have any violent clips? We'd like to use that in the story. And I said, well, I'm not really promoting that, and it might be a copyright violation, and let's not go there. And then they said, well, we've got this story from Newsweek, and they had ripped one page out of Newsweek about a copycat crime where a subway toll taker had been lit on fire in a manner similar to a movie. And they said, what can you say about this? And I said, well, as an economist, you can't draw, a very good, I could draw thousands of lines through one data point, but I don't think that you can say much about copycat crime statistically. And we had a little talk, and they photographed, they did the film. And then that night I watched it, and you never heard my voice. You heard the reporter. And the reporter said that I had worked studying the impact of violence on children as a psychologist. And it was a great, pretty interesting story. Unfortunately, my chair happened to be watching. So he said, "Great research, Jay. Didn't know about that." So it is interesting that local television news, very demand-driven, not a whole lot on the supply side in terms of ability. And actually, the program, there's a great book, The News About the News, where the two authors who are journalists look at the Washington, D.C. market and contrast the number of people that the Washington Post has as reporters to cover the local market, which is over 100, and the number of reporters which the local NBC affiliate, WRC, which I grew up watching and loved, they had fewer than 10 people to cover the market. So a lot of what you see sometimes on local television is just rip and read from the newspapers. And so that's another reason that you have to worry about the decline of the quality of newspapers. Stuart.
Well, I'm intrigued by the statistics you had about the change in network news from '69 until today. I'm trying to figure out what hypotheses I could have to explain that. And let me tell you, because they were still profit maximizing companies back then. So I'm wary of the story that says, well, they were willing to do public service then in a way that they're not, in a way they're not now. And let me tell you what I thought that at least occurs to me, and maybe there's a better explanation, I don't know, is, as you know, advertising doesn't capture intensity of preference, doesn't capture willingness to pay. And I wonder if part of the story is it turns out that the cable networks have done a very good job of hiving off those who have a higher willingness to pay, and that skews toward more hard news. So once you eliminate those people who get to register their intensity of preferences a little bit more in the world of cable than in the world of broadcast, what is left is people who tend to be slightly more soft news oriented. So it isn't a profit maximizing, not profit maximizing story. It's a story of, in each case, you're maximizing, you're hitting the biggest part of the bell curve of the market. It's just that the market has shifted a little bit.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. I think that it could have been the FCC looking over the shoulder. I mean, one of the things that's been talked about is when the networks had their scandals in the late 50s with quiz shows and things like that, one of the things they decided was, hey, let's get some news on as a way to please Congress and the FCC. I do think there was a willingness to trade off some profit for the feeling that they're doing the right thing. The trade-off wasn't that great when you only had 7 channels. It's a lot more. Your question about who's watching cable, there's good research on political science that shows that the people who are peeling off to cable are doing it to watch entertainment programming. I mean, there's a small subset that likes C-SPAN, but that, for instance, if you look at who watches television, the presidential debates, that folks who have cable are gleefully fleeing to entertainment programming, and the people who love entertainment programming but don't have cable basically watch the presidential debates in higher numbers because their options are fewer. So cable makes the world safe for entertainment preferences, and I'm not. That's not pejorative to me. The other thing is, as an economist, I respect people's preferences, and at the end of the day, I don't know. And this goes back again to the black box about whether we should want people to watch Sports Center or or Chris Matthews. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Returning a little bit to the comparative thing. There's a great deal of sort of rhetorical interest in the disparity between attitudes, I think, in the American and non-Western, particularly European world right now. And it seems that a prime explainer, prime sort of explaining variable for that is media. But I'm doing a little bit of research right now, particularly in the particular area of criminal representations in the news media. And it seems like there's really not much comparative data comparing the content between American media and non-American media. And I'm just curious, as someone who's very experienced in news media research, is there sort of a research design problem that's inherent in that, or is it just not out there? I mean, why is it not there?
It's interesting. There's a great quote, information wants to be free, but it's wrong. You always have to ask why information exists. We have good content data in the United States on some media content for a couple of reasons. Sometimes it becomes a political issue that appeals to marginal voters, and the government funds research on content. If you look back at the burst of the last really good content analysis on that was done on entertainment programming, done by the networks and cable, it was a deal worked out with Senator Simon, where he said, I won't push Senate legislation on you if you will fund content research. So it's interesting how content research gets funded. There is interesting data that Pew just did on opinions across countries of the United States, and they find, for instance, in different countries such as Egypt and other countries in the Middle East, that consumption of Al Jazeera is associated with factual misunderstandings about the United States. And a Rockefeller Brothers study here found that consumption of Fox News is associated with factual mistakes about understanding of the Iraq War. But then people jump on the bandwagon and say, therefore, the consumption caused the misunderstanding. But what they haven't done is said, what was the content, A, of those two things, and B, maybe if you have a worldview, you like to see it reinforced. And so if you believe X about the Bush administration, then you turn on Fox News to hear them tell you that. So it's very hard, other than if you go back to television violence studies, I think you need to do controlled experiments in the lab, and that can tell you more. We're almost running out of time. I'll tell you my favorite controlled lab experiment done by Chateau Iyengar, where he wanted to look at how you tell a story on the network evening news affects people's opinion. And he had a story, say, about poverty. And he showed it to people in the lab as part of a network evening news program. And some set of the people saw the story about poverty as an individual poor person. So they saw a vignette of a poor person. Another group of people, similar characteristics, saw a story about poverty statistics. And then if you look at pre and post and looked at how people's attitudes changed, the people who saw the individual story, which is more entertaining, by the way, because it's human interest, because you're talking about an individual, they were more likely to say poverty is a function of poor people's fault, that person was poor because it was their fault, and they did not bring in poverty as a way to evaluate the president's performance, President Reagan at the time. Those people who saw a story of poverty in terms of statistics thought about poverty as a social problem and were more likely to bring poverty into play when they were evaluating President Reagan. Now, it's from the lab, UCLA, but to me that's an interesting way to study the impact of the media. Final question before the free food? Yes.
So, are people right or wrong to worry about media concentration, given that, in theory, large or small firms would still have the same incentives as the ones you described?
Okay. Media concentration in 30 seconds. There is actually a great article by Steiner in 1952 where he says it may be the case, and you probably know this one, it may be the case that media concentration yields more diverse outcomes. What would the argument be? That if you had 5 people competing for market share in a particular market, they all might be trying to get the middle of the road audience, but if it was more concentrated, the person with higher concentration already captures the middle of the road channel and might be more likely to diversify. The 2 articles that I've seen on this indicate that actually might be true. That is, for instance, if you, I'm going to say something controversial. Well, I'll say NPR. It was on NPR. Okay, it was on NPR that as Clear Channel ownership goes up within radio markets, so does product diversity. And the same thing appears in newspaper markets, that you actually get more diverse coverage as ownership is more concentrated. But I think there's so much that we don't know empirically. That's why I did not have a chapter on that in my book. I mean, I thought, from a branding perspective, wouldn't it be great if I could say something about concentration? And then I thought, you know, I think it's too hard. I don't think we can do it yet. So that's why it doesn't play a big role in my book. Okay.
Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.